I'm wondering if your guest is familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations and Kennedy's connection with that. There have been a lot of presidents. Actually, I'm not sure on this, but I know Truman, Reagan, and possibly Kennedy were not members of the Council on Foreign Relations, but they had advisors around them telling them what to do.
It is true that many presidents had affiliations with the council and others didn't. I don't think that is...
Explain what the Council on Foreign Relations is.
Sure. I mean, the Council on Foreign Relations is an organization that meets to discuss foreign relations. And I don't think it's terribly secretive. It's got a fairly wide range of people who are members of it. Even the editor of The Nation magazine, as I believe, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It is certainly, you might say, to a large extent, kind of a part of the establishment gathering and talking about these matters. What's very interesting, by the way, about the council is that Allen Dulles was really one of the creators of the council, one of the very early people. He was actually running, essentially, the council prior to taking on the CIA.
What happened to Allen Dulles when he left the CIA?
Well, this is very interesting, and again, in Family of Secrets, I kind of trace him a little bit. He leaves the CIA. Prescott Bush, who's up for re-election in the United States Senate from Connecticut, abruptly, right in the middle of the campaign, announces he's dropping out. He says, "I'm tired and I'm not well." By the way, he goes on to live many, many years after that, and he seems concerned to do something else. George H.W. Bush's life suddenly changes. All of these people's lives suddenly change. Allen Dulles begins traveling. He asks for a list of CIA officers in Texas, and he shows up in this whole flurry of activity. He actually shows up in Dallas, supposedly on a book tour, right before November 22. I mean, this is all just facts. You can make what you want of them. You can say that they're nothing. But by the way, many, many intelligence figures connected to Dallas, November 22. In fact, we now know the high likelihood that E. Howard Hunt, who was very close again with Allen Dulles, was in Dallas on November 22. And very interestingly, one of the later CIA directors, apparently aware that this could come out, actually contacted a journalist and said, "Hey, it turns out Hunt was in Dallas that day, and we just want you to know that whatever he was doing was not authorized. This is completely unknown, but it's in Family of Secrets." He, as Richard Helms, actually calls this journalist and says, "Yeah, I mean, our guy was there. He was there." And E. Howard Hunt, of course, was involved with all of these coups, in Guatemala and what have you. And then there was David Atlee Phillips, another key figure in these sort of more elite sectors of CIA covert action. All of these figures connected to Dallas. And, by the way, in Family of Secrets, I go into all these military intelligence figures, including people who forced their way into the pilot car of Kennedy's motorcade. There are all these connections that are not known. And, by the way, if you want to go on with George H.W. Bush, Lee Harvey Oswald...
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
No, I want you to talk about that.
Okay, I'll talk about that. Lee Harvey Oswald, in the last year of his life, the last year of John F. Kennedy's life, Lee Harvey Oswald actually had a mentor. There was a man who would come over to his house and take him and Marina, and he would drive them.
His wife, Marina.
Right. He would drive them. They would help them with lodging and looking for jobs and take them to parties and all kinds of things. And this man was a Russian emigre named George de Mohrenschildt. He was from a kind of an upper class Russian family that had fled the revolution there, and he was extremely well connected, and it's very, very clear. I have an entire chapter of Family Secrets just on this man George de Mohrenschildt, who's absolutely fascinating. But George de Mohrenschildt was really the father figure to Lee Harvey Oswald in the year before the assassination. Now, you would think this would be of interest. You would think it would also be of interest that George de Mohrenschildt had an old friend, and his old friend's name was George H.W. Bush.
It had to be a different one.
Yeah. Well, actually,
There are so many.
it's very interesting because the Warren Commission interviewed de Mohrenschildt extensively because they had to. And if you read the transcripts, and I, again, go through all of this in Family of Secrets, you can see that the man who's asking him questions is doing everything he can not to figure out who are the big names in George de Mohrenschildt's life. Bush's name never comes up. George de Mohrenschildt knew Allen Dulles. And again, they treat him as this sort of odd character, and thank you very much for coming in and talking to us. And what we later on, some years later, we find out George de Mohrenschildt in 1976, when Bush is now the head of the CIA, George de Mohrenschildt writes him a letter. And the letter comes into CIA headquarters in Langley, and the letter seems a little bit sort of crazy, and so the staff there say, well, it's addressed
Just
to
some
Mr. Bush,
nutcase,
but he must
yeah.
be a nut. So they actually send a little memo attached to this letter, and they say, Director Bush, we assume you don't know this man, but just to be on the safe side, here's this letter, and if you know him, just let us know and how we should respond. So Bush actually sits down at a typewriter. He doesn't ask a secretary to do it, and he types his own note for the record, and he says, I do know this man. He was the uncle of my prep school roommate. And he said, I had a few dealings with him over the years. I know he seemed to have some money. And he says, I kid you not, he says he had some connection to Oswald when Oswald, now I love this pun, shot to prominence. And he says, I do not remember the details of my friend George de Mohrenschildt's dealings with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, if nothing else, that's grounds for malpractice as CIA director, because how can you be the head of the agency and not be interested in the man who shot the president?
Yeah, and somebody that you know, somebody that you have a connection
Personally.
to. You know that he has a relationship to this guy, and you wouldn't investigate, you wouldn't ask him, you wouldn't be pursuing something that relates to him?
Well, it gets even more interesting because in
Insanity.
this letter, George de Mohrenschildt says, Dear George, I'm a great fan of yours and so forth, but I am worried because there's some sort of a net closing in on me. He said, maybe I've been indiscreet in talking too much about Lee Oswald, but I'm an old man now and I can't do any harm to anybody. Would you please do something about this to remove this net? And George Bush sends a letter back on CIA letterhead, and he says, I'm sure there's nothing going on. I checked. Nobody's interested in you. Good luck to you. And 6 months later, George de Mohrenschildt is dead. Shotgun blast to the head. Suicide.
Oh, I almost said a bad word. Wow. 808-0810 is the telephone number, 8080-810. We have to take a break, but first let's get Mike in here. Mike went away. 8080-810, I'm Pat Thurston. You're listening to KGO News Talk 810.